just the kind of delightful young person he was looking for, he decided, and began contemplating marriage, though without informing Caroline. He was outraged when he discovered that she had several other lovers, and he offered her money to give them up. Then he decided that he needed another year-long holiday in Italy to think things over. Caroline doesn't seem to have been invited, but when Schopenhauer left her behind in Berlin, he promised that he would be with her in spirit. Caroline gave a little more substance to this airy promise when she wrote to him a few weeks later announcing that she was pregnant. Schopenhauer gallantly decided to remain with her in spirit and continued his long tour of Italy. By the time he returned to Berlin, Caroline had given birth to a son. It was around this time that Schopenhauer became involved in another incident that was to have unforeseen long-term consequences. One afternoon he was waiting in his apartment, keenly anticipating a tryst with Caroline. One can only assume that he was listening intently at the front door for her approach, because he happened to hear Frau Market, the 45-year-old seamstress from next door, gossiping with a couple of her friends on the landing. Irritated by the continuing gossip, and probably wishing to avoid becoming a target of it himself, Schopenhauer opened his door and abruptly told his neighbour to do her gossiping elsewhere. Frau Market took umbrage at being interrupted by this rude little man and refused to budge, whereupon Schopenhauer became extremely irritated. He ended up grabbing her around the waist and removing her bodily while she kicked and screamed. Frau Market took Schopenhauer to court on a charge of assault, and Schopenhauer was given a small fine of 20 thaler. But by now Frau Market had discovered that Schopenhauer was a rich man, and she lodged an appeal, alleging that as a result of the fall she had suffered when Schopenhauer threw her out, she was now completely paralyzed on her right side and could barely move her arm. Schopenhauer contested this vigorously, and the case dragged on in the usual fashion so that the lawyers could earn their fees. Eventually, 6 years later, Schopenhauer lost the case. His superior sarcastic attitude had not endeared him to the court, and he was ordered to pay Frau Market 15 thalers a quarter for as long as her injury persisted. Frau Market evidently took this judgment as a challenge, and managed to prolong the effects of her alleged injury for the next 20 years, until her death. When Schopenhauer learned of her demise, and realized that he would no longer have to pay, he wittily recorded in Latin in his journal, "Obit annus, abit onus," which isn't as rude as it sounds and merely means, "The old woman dies, the burden departs." Meanwhile, copies of The World as Will and Representation continued to gather dust in the bookshops. Still, Schopenhauer was being deprived of the fame that was his due, and to add insult to injury, Hegel was still packing them in at his lectures, while a nearby lecture hall remained conspicuously empty. Having tried the direct approach to sabotaging his great rival, Schopenhauer now decided to try a more conventional philosophical tactic. He wrote, describing Hegelianism as the impudence of a scribbler of nonsense, characterizing its originator as a flat-headed, illiterate charlatan. But still no one took notice. In the meantime, Schopenhauer decided to try his hand at translation, making plans to translate Hume into German and Kant into English. Unfortunately, nothing came of these schemes, which would certainly have been of incalculable benefit to philosophic circles on both sides of the North Sea. Nothing came of his plans for marriage, either. He appears to have loved Caroline Medon, but wasn't sure whether her social standing, or her illegitimate child, would be fitting for the world-famous philosopher he would surely become. Then he, wrongly, suspected that she had tuberculosis, which was regarded socially in much the same compassionate light as AIDS nowadays. A good psychiatrist would probably have sorted Schopenhauer out, but it was still 30 years before Freud arrived on the scene, and could later become deeply influenced by Schopenhauer's philosophy, sufficient for him to discover the very method by which he might have cured its author. Much as this knot defies unravelling, so Schopenhauer continued to dither between his loving ego and his forbidding, paternal superego. The affair with Caroline dragged on and off for years, and long after it was finally over he was to remember her in his will. Though at the same time he characteristically excluded all claims by a certain young Carl Ludwig Medon. The man who claimed to understand the world, and everything that was wrong with it, never did understand what was wrong with himself. In 1831, cholera swept through Berlin, and Schopenhauer fled, This was the outbreak that killed his arch-rival Hegel. 2 years later, at the age of 45, Schopenhauer settled in Frankfurt. He was to remain in this city for the next 28 years, living a bachelor life whose extreme regularity was modelled on that of his hero, Kant. This is the image of Schopenhauer that has passed on to posterity. The figure we love to loathe, the acid old fart of Frankfurt, to rise to the Schopenhauerian level of philosophic character assessment. He took to dressing in old-fashioned clothes, though impeccably tailored, and developed an obsession about noise. I have long been of the opinion that the quantity of noise anyone can comfortably endure is in inverse proportion to his mental powers. After rising late and taking his coffee, he would read for 3 hours. Then he would play his flute, Rossini, con amore. After this it was time for a late luncheon at the round table in the prestigious Englischer Hof on Rossmarkt. In the afternoon he would retire to the reading rooms of the Casino Society to read the latest copy of the Times, which had arrived from London. Then he would set off for a long walk, a familiar local figure, striding briskly down the pavement, talking to himself. On these walks he would invariably be accompanied by his poodle, which he called Atma, Indian for the world's soul. As befitted its exalted title, the poodle would trot silently and inscrutably at his muttering master's side, enacting this instructive tableau of the philosopher and his riddle. On his return home he would read long into the night while the world and its soul slept, the latter at his feet. Schopenhauer read widely in literature and philosophy, and after 19 years of silent indignation at his lack of fame, he published a second philosophical work, On the Will in Nature. The preface of this work contains a hilarious invective against Hegel which has little to do with philosophy, and the book itself is mainly an elaboration of points in his earlier great work. He also brought out another edition of The World as Will and Representation, but this too did not succeed in breaking down the resistance of a dull world. In this second edition, Schopenhauer expands upon ideas that he now considered to be insufficiently developed in the first edition. Here we find the full version of his ideas on political philosophy and the role of the state. These are heavily influenced by his pessimistic view of human nature. In his political philosophy, Schopenhauer followed on from the 17th century English political philosopher Thomas Hobbes, author of The Leviathan. According to Hobbes, without government, the life of man is solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. These were sentiments with which Schopenhauer heartily concurred. Indeed, there are times when he appeared to find this the case even when people did have government. Hobbes saw the origin of the state in the natural wish of people to overcome this primitive state of affairs. Thus any form of government was better than none. From this, Hobbes made a giant leap to the conclusion that people should therefore conform to the dictates of whatever government they found themselves under. Life in any state, be it ever so malign, was always better than a life that was nasty, brutish, and short, where nothing constructive of any sort could be achieved. Schopenhauer concurs with this view, though injecting his own characteristic element of wit and misanthropy. For him, humanity essentially consists of nothing but beasts of prey. The state acts as a muzzle to these wild animals, transforming them into harmless, grass-consuming cattle. Humanity does not choose between good and evil. Instead, as we have seen, it is driven by an evil, universal will. Such beings can have no real idea of justice. All they know is a basic, negative version of this ideal. When they suffer an infringement of their will, they experience pain and indignation, which they see as injustice. Yet at the same time, these base creatures are always seeking for opportunities to inflict themselves on others, impeding their will and arousing their sense of injustice. Thus the fundamental purpose of the state must be to prevent this from happening. The citizen must at all costs be deterred from inflicting his will upon others in a detrimental fashion. Enlightened thinkers, from Kant to the Romantics, had previously developed a more benevolent view of the state. Its purpose was to improve the morals of its citizens, benignly encouraging them to become better human beings. The state should be a force for the good, giving meaning to the lives of its citizens instead of being simply a necessary evil, checking their baser instincts. Schopenhauer perceptively saw what the result of this seemingly more benevolent state could be. Such Encouragement to become better citizens led to the imposition of a collective will, or to the cultivation of a uniform behaviour that the state considered to be improving. It left no room for individuality, for the citizen to develop in his own fashion. Although the romantic and enlightened view of the state may seem more immediately appealing than Schopenhauer's grim pessimism, in practice such improvement of the citizens by the state could lead to the worst excesses. Schopenhauer abhorred both the revolutionaries of the left and the authoritarian right-wing Prussian state, so beloved of Hegel. Both sought to impose their own version of how to improve the lot of the people, one by progressive egalitarianism, the other by conservative authoritarianism. The state's conception of values would either be created or preserved, but either way it would be imposed at the expense of any alternative set of values. Schopenhauer was to be proved correct in his assessment of the similar outcome of these apparent opposites. The worst excesses of state improvement in the following 20th century would be communist and fascist. Despite his well-heeled and protected way of life, Schopenhauer found that he was not immune from the vagaries of politics. He was to receive a nasty fright when uprisings broke out all over Europe in 1848, the year of revolution. The disturbances in Germany not only upset his daily routine, they also threatened to disrupt the commercial sources of his private income. What was the world coming to? Fortunately, the unrest in Frankfurt was quickly put down, and it was soon safe for a gentleman of independent means to walk the streets with his poodle. The revolting citizens had demonstrated all too plainly that this assessment of their character was correct. Such creatures needed to be muzzled, not encouraged. To shout abuse at a law-abiding philosopher, accompanied by the world's soul. But other indignities were less easy to live with. The deep inner pain at his lack of success continued to rankle, though he did his best to disguise this. The long wait for recognition had now persisted for decades, and despite his acerbic buoyancy in public, he was slowly becoming reconciled to the fact that his life had been nothing but one long failure. At the age of 63, Schopenhauer decided to publish his essays and maxims, but no one was interested in printing them. In the end, he managed to persuade a minor Berlin bookseller to bring out a small edition by promising to finance it himself. This work he called Parerga and Paralipomena, from the Latin ornaments and omissions. It contains a series of bitterly witty pieces on a wide range of topics. These essays and aphorisms remain as fresh, perceptive, and provocative today as they were when first published. Schopenhauer's position is often aggressively conservative, laced with an incongruous anarchistic streak, and leavened with witty egoism. His views on women are predictably unacceptable. For example, only a male intellect, clouded by sexual desire, could call the stunted, narrow-shouldered, broad-hipped, and short-legged sex the fair sex. Viewed as a mirror of its author, this scarcely reflects favourably on the state of his intellect or the female company he kept. But he has interesting unconservative things to say about monogamy, suicide, the Church's involvement in the slave trade, ethics, thinking for oneself, and ghosts. Parerga and Paralipomena is by far the most readable work written by any major philosopher since Plato, and remains surprisingly in tune with modern sensibilities, despite certain easily recognizable grotesqueries. Yet, though this work certainly reflects Schopenhauer's philosophical position, it can hardly be called philosophy. It remains, for the most part, a philosophical eccentricity, not quite in the same comic category as Leibniz's scheme for flooding the state of Hanover, Berkeley's proposal for tar water, or Wittgenstein's reflections on culture, but at the same time not entirely free of unintended farce. In April 1853, Parerga and Paralipomena was given a favourable notice in the Westminster Review of London, which was edited by George Eliot, who obviously didn't pay much attention to the books she sent out for review. In those days, German intellectuals had a healthy, if somewhat misplaced, respect for British thought. At once, all the German intellectual periodicals took notice of Schopenhauer's work, and he became famous overnight. The last person to rejoice at this fairy-tale ending to his endeavours was Schopenhauer himself, who stuck resolutely to his routine and remained as crotchety as ever, though in fact he secretly exulted in his success, covertly asking his few remaining acquaintances to seek out all mentions of him in the papers so that he could read them over breakfast. Young aficionados of the new philosophic star flocked to the Englischer Hof and bribed the waiters for seats at the round table, where their enthusiasm was subjected to the customary biting wit. These aficionados went away smarting but overjoyed, convinced they had been insulted by the finest mind in Europe.